Chapter 2. A New Toy. "Oh, God, stop!" cried out Jim. Jim's eyes, if you could call them eyes, felt like they were pulled out of his head, facing in different directions and filled with so much white light they should have instantaneously incinerated. It was like staring into 10 suns, cross-eyed. From the feedback of his own voice he could hear over the microphone Nate had installed. His own voice sounded tinny and more robotic than human. It sounded like Jim was speaking through a fan. Nate had turned his volume down so Jim wasn't certain Nate could understand exactly how horribly painful his vision was. But finally the blazing white light gave way to forgiving darkness. Jim longed to see again, but he was regretting asking for this. It was a million times more uncomfortable compared to the procedure Nate used to give Jim his hearing back. While sometimes distorted and often at unacceptable volume, it seemed Jim's brain could rein in bad audio. Bad video was another thing. And Nate, while very skilled for a 13-year-old boy, was working without a manual. "Just chill, old man. I guess the video input isn't compatible. I was hoping this ancient tape deck would work with the line-ins," said Nate. "Tape deck? You mean a VCR?" said Jim. Even when Jim was a kid, a VCR was an outdated piece of tech. How old did this kid think he was? And where did he find a working, nearly century-old VCR? "Nate, the neural encasements were designed over 75 years after the VCR. It's got to be at least HDMI or something," said Jim, struggling not to get angry with his one and only friend in the whole world. Nate pulled several functional neural encasements from the rubble of the New U storage farm. According to Nate, Jim was the only one he found that actually responded when he tapped into the case's audio channel. Nate did so with a cell phone and a bootleg wire harness he made from old computer parts. It was a remarkable achievement. The kid had to be at least 4 or 5 times smarter than Jim ever had been. Really, Jim was impressed with himself just for remembering the 4-letter acronym HDMI and using it without saying the wrong letter. He was only 50% certain it wasn't HMDI. "It's not HDMI, jeez. It's an analog format because your brain isn't a computer, duh," Nate responded sarcastically. The fact that those were completely different things only helped to reinforce just how dumb Jim felt talking to this kid. That's why composite video made sense, but I'm thinking it's something else entirely. It's not like audio input, it's like some kind of image interpretation interface. As Nate trailed off, Jim could hear him rummaging through some parts. Whatever Nate was looking for, it couldn't have been close, as the sound of his search grew fainter and fainter. While Nate hadn't been very forthcoming about where he lived, Jim could guess it wasn't a normal house. There were no living room sounds, TV in the background, or voices of others. The sound echoed quite a bit, but it was possible that was due to the poor quality of the microphone Jim was listening through. Something he knew he didn't hear was a mother or father telling Nate to wash up for dinner or go to bed. Over the last 2 days, it was just Jim and Nate. Jim wanted to pry into the details of his savior's life, but he held back. First off, he really wanted to keep Nate focused on helping him regain his senses. Secondly, the last thing he wanted to do was to lose his only ally in the world. Nate could toss Jim in a corner and that'd be the end of him. Jim was little more than a heavy paperweight at this point, and a blind one at that. Trapped in the darkness, Jim could only concentrate on his tiny audio link to the world. There were few sounds most of the time. An odd bird in the distance. There was a buzzing sound that Jim was 80% certain were cicada. Occasionally there was a loud growl from some large trucks. Whenever that would occur, Nate would yank Jim's voice output, banishing Jim's voice with a single button. How humiliating to be silenced by the push of a button. But whatever or whomever was in those trucks must have represented something very bad for Nate. Jim doubted it was a case of Nate simply avoiding his parents. It was more like those people who were a threat to Nate's very life. What has become of the world, Jim thought. In the distance, excited footsteps of a small child approached. They seemed smaller than Nate's. There was a scratching and clamoring as things in the room were being moved. Finally, Jim let out a nervous, "Hello?" This was followed by quick scampering, sudden silence. That was not Nate. Jim pondered if he should keep his mouth shut. Or maybe he should start yelling he was the police and hope the intruder would be scared off. But before he could execute his clever plan to psych out the intruder, a small girl's voice answered, "Hello?" In hindsight, Jim felt it was a bad idea to answer back. There were a million things a little girl could do to him in this state. If she thought it would be funny to throw him out a window or hook his brain up to a wall outlet, he was as good as dead. But his instincts told him he wasn't in any danger, and the only person he had talked to in years was Nate. So Jim replied, "I'm in the black box." "No way," said the little girl in disbelief. "Yes way," said Jim. "But how do you get in that little box?" said the curious voice as it grew closer. "Very carefully," laughed Jim. Jim expected the girl to laugh as well, but instead a gasp of astonishment came from the child. Jim didn't have a lot of experience with children. His little joke was instead met with a loud thumping of a child's hand tapping on the case. The sound echoed through the microphone with jarring volume. It briefly made Jim consider every time he ever tapped on the outside of a fishbowl. "Hey, please don't do that," requested Jim, as politely but sternly as he could muster. "Can you come out?" asked the girl. He could tell from the sound she was poking and prodding the case. Again, Jim's hindsight reared up to remind him how easily this curious child could kill him. "Not if I want to live. Please stop touching the case," said Jim. The sound, though, suggested she was not interested in complying. "Are you a robot, or are you really, really small?" said the girl, as she continued to poke the case. Jim started to go over in his mind exactly how many wires and tubes she might have access to, and which were likely to come loose with a good tug. Of course, Jim had no idea. All the time he had spent during his neural encasement hooked up to the wealth of the internet, not once did it ever occur to him to find out anything at all about the technology that was currently keeping him alive. He always knew his lazy ignorance would be the death of him. "Come on," said the little girl. "Open up and let me see." "Stop! Please stop!" said Jim. But with the volume of his voice turned down, he hardly sounded imposing. He could hear her little hands clawing at the case, eager to learn secrets. "Please stop messing with the case. You could kill me," begged Jim. The rustling sound grew louder despite his pleas, and then stopped. There was a frustrated groan from the girl, followed by footsteps away. Jim was about to breathe a sigh of relief when the sound of something metallic and heavy was dragged off a nearby shelf. "If you're not going to open up, I'm going to crack you open like an egg," said the little menacing voice. Jim could only guess what she was holding. Was it a hammer? A wrench? A steel pipe? Whatever it was about to break his neural encasement and most certainly end his life. "Nate! Help!" cried out Jim through his small speaker. At that point, Jim might as well have been a tiny little doll. One child saves him only for another to be his end. With a few whacks, his brain would soon be sitting on the outside of the case. Would he feel the blows? Would it hurt to die like that? How long could he last exposed to air? His life might be quite sad at the moment, but he wanted to keep it. He had survived the fire, years of dark imprisonment, all to be ended in the hands of some small, bored child? In the distance, Jim could hear metal doors slam open, and Nate's voice said, "Drop the hammer, Amy! Drop it now!" "No! I want to see what's inside! Show me!" said the little girl. From the volume, Jim guessed that she must be hovering right over the top of his case. "You do it and I'll melt every one of your dolls into a puddle and cut off all your hair. Don't push me, you know I'll do it," said Nate with a surprising authoritarian voice. Was Amy his sister? There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity, then followed by the beautiful sound of a hammer ringing as it hit a concrete floor. "Fine, whatever, Natalie. They're about to hand out bread at the mission again. You better stop playing with your little robot girlfriend if you want to eat today," said Amy in disgust. Then Jim could hear her little feet storm off. After the sound of the feet trailed off, Jim could hear Nate getting closer, and Nate asked, "Are you okay, Jim?" Then he heard the familiar sounds of Nate poking around his case, just as he had done for the last few days. "I don't know. What's it look like out there?" "God, I thought for sure she was going to kill me," said Jim's tinny voice over the small speaker. "Looks okay. There's not a lot she can unhook from the outside. I'm going to have to hide you from now on," said Nate. "Is there some way I can call you if I get into trouble?" asked Jim. "No, I can't afford a net connection, and I'll be caught for sure if I try to patch one in. Maybe I could set up some kind of radio connection. In the meantime, I gotta hide you somewhere. Amy will be back," Nate said. "On the upside, I think I got a solution for your eyes." "Really? What have you got?" asked Jim. This was followed by a lot of shuffling sounds on the microphone. Things were plugged in and unplugged. A small fan whirred to life. Suddenly, a 4-foot-wide, glowing gray screen appeared in the darkness in front of Jim. It was like the virtual interface windows Jim used to summon up when his brain was still hooked up to the New U servers. "I see something, Nate. It's like a window or something," said Jim with excitement. The blank gray box suddenly filled with a small, sly-looking animated cat. The cartoon cat put out its paw, and the words Virtual Soft appeared on the screen. "It says Virtual Soft," said Jim with gleeful excitement. "Yeah, I found the head of a broken robot toy. Its output connectors are just like the ones on your case," said Nate. "I thought your sensor net might be able to read it." Suddenly, the window filled with a live, wide-angle video feed of a dirty young boy in tattered clothing. Behind him loomed a dusty-looking warehouse filled with old parts and scraps. A few of the windows in the background were shattered, and the neon lights above were either broken or unpowered. With the exception of a dusty desk lamp, only the skylights illuminated the inside with the dull blue light of the fading day. Around the edges of Jim's hovering screen, various bits of information floated, most of which were error messages probably related to the robot this head was no longer attached to. None of the information seemed related to Jim's neural encasement. While the video feed was amazing, it also confirmed Jim's worst fear about Nate's life. Jim felt fortunate that in that moment Nate couldn't see the look of concern Jim would have had on his face if he had a body. Jim choked down the immediate feelings of sadness and instead happily stated, "I can see you, Nate." "Awesome. Okay, so I'm hungry and there's no way I'm missing out on my bread," said Nate, happy with his success. Nate's arms then circled Jim's case and covered his new robotic eye. The floating screen filled with a close-up of Nate's torn and grease-stained shirt. "Don't say anything to anyone else. I don't trust these people and neither should you." "That's what Dad said Nate as he carried Jim's case. That was the first moment Nate ever acknowledged his parents. The tinge of sadness was impossible to miss. Jim could feel his heart sink with those last words, even if he didn't have a heart anymore. Jim had guessed that Nate had a rough life, but apparently he had no idea just how bad. After some banging and grinding sounds, Nate's shirt pulled back and Jim could again see the world through his floating screen. The dirty little boy with an upbeat smile appeared roughly 6 inches below the shelf Jim was now resting on. "Remember, don't let anyone find you," warned Nate. "I'll stay quiet. Thank you, Nate. Thanks for everything," said Jim. Despite having no lungs, no eyes, and no breath, Jim could still feel himself getting choked up. "Go get that bread," said Jim. "I'm on it," said Nate, and he took off running. Imagine, thought Jim, this little kid helping out some old loser like me. I lucked out. Jim stared at the screen that hovered in front of him. He moved towards and away from the screen as if it were a physical object. He could even blink, though he had no eyelids. It was as if he had a body, only it was invisible. The only thing he could see on the screen was the opposing wall of the neglected warehouse. But at that moment, it was enough. Hell, it was amazing. But not nearly as amazing as that kid. What could he ever do to pay Nate back?